Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's discussion on turning the tide on infectious disease and cancer. My name is Megan Palmer. I'm the Executive Director of Biopolicy and Leadership Initiatives at Stanford University. I'm also an adjunct professor in our Department of Bioengineering. The ongoing pandemic has reminded us of the cost of not having adequate systems and strategies to counter infectious disease. And we need to prepare now not only to prevent the next potential pandemic, but also across the wide range of infectious and chronic disease burdens that cause massive burdens on our societies. The real question is, how do we do it? Now, we could be discouraged about the complexity of this challenge, and we've heard a lot of that in our last few days here in Davos. This section is really about celebrating the progress that has been made. The progress that has been made against many of these chronic burdens. And we really want to understand what has worked over the last decade and how this can really help to inform the next 10 years of global health. Now, I am a systems engineer and a bioengineer by background, so I'm particularly excited about some of the new tools and technologies that allow breakthroughs, but there are many more challenges that are coupled to scaling these types of breakthroughs effectively. So how do we get them to more people more quickly? How do we set goals that are really ambitious enough to set a trajectory that doesn't descend into these cycles of panic and neglect that we see so much? And ultimately, how do we ensure that we put people, all people everywhere, at the center of our planning? And we are very fortunate today that we have some excellent panelists that are been invited to speak to different aspects of the process for actually scaling up a medical breakthrough. So to begin, we have Her Excellency Minister Rania Al-Mashat, who is Egypt's Minister of International Cooperation since December of 2019. And she previously served as the country's first female Minister of Tourism. Prior to that, she was advisor to the chief economist of the International Monetary Fund in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us. Then we have Michelle Longmire, who is the co-founder and chief executive officer of Medable. As a physician scientist who's also trained at Stanford, she identified critical barriers to drug development and founded Medable to pioneer a new category of clinical trial technologies that remove traditional roadblocks and accelerate the process of research. Next, we have Nida Marav, who is the Chief Executive Officer at Metabiota, which is a company that specializes in measuring, mitigating, and managing epidemic risk. And she was previously Vice President of Data Science at Metabiota and has many years of experience in modeling and risk assessment with a focus on infectious disease spread and its economic impacts. And last but certainly not least is Umra Omar, who's the founder and executive director of Safari Doctors, which is an initiative that provides basic and potentially life-saving medical services, youth community health trainings, and civic engagement for women. So for those of you who are joining us online, if you are engaging with this session, please use the hashtag WEF22. So to begin, I really would like us to start with a discussion of the case studies that might help to bring us hope about what is possible here. So I'd like to start off with you, Minister, and the reduction, a dramatic reduction in hepatitis C prevalence and mortality in Egypt, from the highest rates in the world in 2016 to now having really practically eliminated the disease is a great success story in public health investment. And so what are the biggest lessons learned from that experience, and what can other countries and regions that are looking to tackle such a big challenge take when thinking about their own strategies?
A few points to make. Health, which is SDG number 3, is not divorced from development in a country. So this sector is fundamental for human capital development, for assisting in having healthy and productive labor force. And that's why in 2014 our constitution identified that spending to health and education has to be a certain percent to increase the focus on healthcare with the angle that it's a development paradigm. And in order to move forward, when we look at hepatitis C, it was very entrenched among citizens in Egypt. We had close to 5 million. The whole world had 700 million, I think, so that was a big number. And there was a initiative called 100 Million Health, because our population is 100 million. And there was testing, mass testing that took place across the country. That testing resulted in two things: identifying those with hepatitis C, but also having a record of those with chronic illnesses related to heart, diabetes, blood pressure. And I'll mention that was very, very effective because this took place before COVID. So when COVID hit, those who were tested for hepatitis C were given the medication, and that's how it was eliminated from the population. And this December 2021 is when Egypt is free of hepatitis C, and it was also recognized by the World Health Organization, which was ahead of schedule. So this was a very important breakthrough. But the other 2 points which are very relevant is the testing, is also that those with chronic illnesses were given the medicine required. So when COVID hit, the population was more resilient, if you will, and we did not have dramatic problems as would anyone think at the outset. 100 million with the pandemic, it would have been quite difficult. 2 extra points: there was a partnership with the World Bank on this early on, so international partnerships are important in design and implementation. And the second is private sector also with respect to, so this concept of collaboration to push an agenda and show tangible results, I think, are extremely important.
This is such, I think, an exciting and important example of seeing the ways that these investments can pay off across multiple different crises as they evolve, and the need for continued engagement. So thank you so much. Michelle, I'd like to turn to you, and I was hoping that you could share a little bit more about Medible's approach and the opportunity you saw, including in the wake of COVID-19, and how that approach worked for being able to scale these types of clinical trials to so many more areas.
Sure, thank you for the opportunity. So, my background, I'm a physician scientist. I practiced medicine at Stanford, and there I was caring for patients with rare autoimmune diseases. And, I would have patients come from all over the world to access our care because we were a subset of physicians who were able to subtype this rare disease called systemic sclerosis. Additionally, that disease had a 90% fatality rate before the discovery of Viagra actually to be repurposed to treat the pulmonary hypertension or the lung involvement. And so being a resident at Stanford and being in Silicon Valley and seeing people coming from all over the world, I thought, the access to these investigational drugs could absolutely be transformed through technology. There's no reason that someone has to come all the way to Stanford. I mean, you think of the limitations and who could even actually make that journey. And so, started Medible with the idea and the inspiration to bring clinical development to anyone in the world. And, I think people not close to clinical trials often think of clinical trials as a philanthropic thing people want to do to, better the population of people living with the diseases they're suffering from. And that's certainly a part of it, but really it's often a top-line choice for a physician and a patient who are looking for something that is going to really improve the patient's life. In oncology, it's often the first go-to. So I started Medible, as an idea. Now we're a team of 700 people worldwide, and we've now done over 300 decentralized clinical trials. And what those are, it's enabling participation outside of the walls of clinics and removing the barriers of having a patient come to Palo Alto, California, or you name where, and facilitating access to those drugs. And prior to the pandemic, the clinical development world, pharma companies, we're like, this is awesome, we see potential benefit, but my $2 billion investment, it's way too risky. So, we were pushing something which was really considered an edge case. And then the pandemic hit, and clinics all over the world shut down. And I think people may not be aware, but this includes clinical trials for people in oncology studies and many different disease areas who were relying on those drugs for continued treatment in many cases. So our company and a number of others who were providing a similar approach became critical partners to the pharmaceutical companies to continue drug development at a time where even the doctors were administering care from their homes. So very unprecedented. And what we determined in being part of the COVID vaccines and the COVID oral therapies and enabling the continuation of many oncology trials all over the world was that actually the return on investment of using this approach, using technology to connect patients to clinical trials, capturing the data in their own homes versus in clinics on a very limited basis, actually return on investment in a phase 3 clinical trial is 14x for a drug developer. And why that matters so much, one of the biggest barriers to drug development is the sheer cost. And we know with COVID, we know with antibiotic resistant drugs, bacteria, that we need to bring down the cost of drug development so we can tackle diseases that are often considered economically not feasible by pharmaceutical companies. So I think what inspires me is that given a window of opportunity for innovation to actually happen and then the rigor to show what that benefit is and learn from there, I think we can really provide new approaches that have a ton of value to transform industries and bring down the cost of drug development and the time. And I think that opens the door to a much brighter future, which excites me.
And we're already beginning to hear similar themes about the reductions in cost you see as you continue to work more upstream and consider really the patient experiences as well and what we need to do throughout the cycle. So as we know, also these breakthroughs are relying not just on medical breakthroughs, but also increasingly on the types of data, and that these can have major impacts on population health. So I was hoping that you could speak a little bit to, how has the pandemic changed the priorities for disease modeling and epidemiological work? And can you maybe connect it also to some of these economic impacts and their estimates?
Yeah, thank you for having me today. I think one of the really bright spots of the pandemic, devastating as it was that there was an unprecedented amount of scientific collaboration and data sharing when it came to genomic sequences. Those came out very early in the pandemic and allowed for the development of vaccines in an unprecedented amount of time. But one of the things that we've been working on for many years is how to look at data from many different sources, including different ministries of health, or whether it's unofficial sources like media reports, and how to conform that data in a way that can really provide insights. And one thing that often comes up is that there's actually a lack of standards in the data that are currently being generated, even within, between ministries of health, even within countries. Different states have, different potentially case definitions, different thresholds of reporting for whether they're confirmed by laboratory testing or whether they are presumed to be cases. So we've spent a lot of time trying to develop standards around this to conform that. And I think one thing that really came out of the pandemic is that there's an unprecedented amount of data that's been generated. I think it's the most studied pandemic that's ever occurred. And so within that data, there's really a great opportunity. We can use it even today as the pandemic continues to have situational awareness, to make decisions, to gain insights about risk factors and what sorts of mitigation measures are working and which ones are not necessarily working. But I think within that, there's also a caution there that we need to understand not only how those data were collected, the metadata associated with them, which standards that they're adhering to, but also what sort of representativeness this data has, because we're not necessarily getting a full picture. We're getting pictures from wherever data are being collected. So just one example is that we know that a lot of testing in the United States has now gone to at-home testing, antigen testing, and that's not really necessarily getting reported back to the health authorities and not really making it into the data that people would be using. And so the danger there is, you're then a lot of people nowadays are throwing it into models without really understanding what the data what's underlying that data, and then maybe drawing conclusions that are perhaps not correct or biased in their results. So I think right now what we see kind of catalyzed by the pandemic is a lot of efforts, global efforts, including WHO Berlin Hub, Rockefeller Institute, Africa CDC, are all working on trying to create these types of data streams, creating standards, and trying to really have this picture that can be used for further analysis. And this includes genomic data, it includes public health data, case reporting, and the kind of the reporting that's compelled to understand what's going on. So I think there's a lot of work happening there, and the hope there is that these groups can really collaborate and work together, create common standards that can then be applied, and that can then, when people start applying models to them, that these can, then we kind of know what we're looking at and understand both what it's telling us and what the limitations are. Because I think that's another thing that's come out of the pandemic, which is that we really have to understand what the data are telling us and what they're not telling us.
Thanks so much. And we're already starting to hear some of the challenges and opportunities start to come out in your comments as well. Well, I was hoping I could turn to you, and we were talking about like collecting data and how do we make sense of it. But you have such great experiences in thinking about, how do we work and reach with some of the hardest to reach populations, and how do we center their experience not only in the midst of this pandemic, but everything else that they experience and need. So I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about what inspires you, maybe some case studies that you've seen on the ground, and also tell us about what you would like to see.
Thank you, Megan, for that. I like the order, how it's come from, the designing, the policy implementers, the data, and now it's like the consumers, or how do you actually access healthcare to the community. And I want us to really talk about the difference between availability and accessibility, and that there's a huge gap in between. And when we talk of accessibility, it doesn't just mean the physical access, there's cultural access, there's the cost implementation, we're talking of geography as well. I'll give you an example, allow me to give you a little story, there's a project that was happening in a particular village where kids had to walk very long distances to fetch water. And, you had project implementation. Yes, there's a water source. Let's put down a well. Fantastic. We've solved, the issue of water being accessible. And come a year later to review this project is that the community was not using the well. The water at their doorsteps was not being used. And kids were still going long distances to fetch the water. And they asked, we brought the water here. What's the problem? It's available right here. And the reality of that community is that the parents are like, if our kids don't go those long distances, they won't have siblings. Meaning, it's like, what's more important right now? So that's our time as adults. So that in itself is that here's something that we see so valuable, we see, as so necessary. And it was the same thing with the pandemic, is that we have, from when we hear talking about the vaccines, the lab, the data, the information, what we had to do as safari doctors is that we travel around Lamu County delivering healthcare at the doorsteps of communities, what we call first mile health, like, healthcare should get to the people. And the challenges that we were dealing with was the stigma around the pandemic, the $300 ride to get to a facility to be able to get a vaccine and then go back to your village. Who are you leaving your 5 kids with in order to do that? So there's this entire culture that needs to be understood. And it's not just in Lamu, it's the same thing in what we're calling the 70% communities that have been left on the margins. Those are the communities that live in rural areas. It's a collective issue. We're talking of infrastructure, education. They all pile up into the aspect of healthcare that we're talking about. So I'm very keen to see how we now push the agenda to talk about accessibility and really defining what that means, because you might think that you are in a country very far away, and what the pandemic taught us is that you are as healthy as the person next to you. I come from the most beautiful place, a paradise called Lamu, where you go on holiday and the person attending to you, their health situation will mirror your health situation. When you go home, you're literally transporting whatever reality it was that you were experiencing there. So connectivity and accessibility are the biggest take-homes that we had.
Well, this is okay. I mean, what we've already seen through the comments here is just the complexity of the challenge for really going all the way from the burden towards the investment. How do you think about scaling things more quickly? How do you think about the data infrastructure challenges across all of this? And then ultimately, people and their experience of this whole thing. And so I'd like to turn to setting the agenda, as you said, right? If we're thinking about these case studies as being instrumental in informing us about how do we take forward the next 10 years. So from each of your vantage points, I would love for you to comment on what would you like to see happen over the next 10 years? I know there have been some really inspiring new initiatives to ask, well, what can Egypt do to help inform and advise other regions that are looking to take on similar challenges? What do you see as the opportunity?
So I'll talk about an extra initiative that we are doing now, which is related to women. So there's also health for women. So there's the mobile testing for breast cancer that goes across different governorates, and also provide women with a list of what the doctor detects, and also this helps with birth control because they're given educated about their situation and so forth, and family control is quite important in countries which are growing very fast, and that's also important. The other thing is regulation. And because culture was mentioned, clinical tests, for example, were a little bit tabooed, and they had to be legislated. So this was something, a law was drafted and passed a few months ago, which opens clinical trials. So this is huge. And private sector now can have clinics to do these trials. This creates ability to better understand, to more jobs. And I'm not a doctor, as everyone here, but started to learn that now cure is going to be individualized. So this is also enormous data that will be available, and it pushes private-public partnerships. Which again, in the spirit of Davos, there's no stakeholder that can do it by itself. Private sector can, governments can't, and there's a very big role for civil society that's on the ground, helping in remote areas and vulnerable places where sometimes government services are not ready available all the time. So those are a few things that are happening, and then. The idea of scaling, when Egypt was the head of the African Union a few years ago, there was a pledge to do the hepatitis C initiative for 1 million Africans, and so that's ongoing as well. And during the pandemic, when it comes to sharing experiences and also helping others in the region when there's need, I think that is also something that. When multilateralism is being doubted, I think that the pandemic, despite everything, has shown that we have to work together to move ahead, because you are as healthy as anyone from any country, not just your own country.
Exactly. And I think that is being highlighted everywhere is that the need for a whole number of different partnerships that are able to shed light on different opportunities in this space. Again, such a vast challenge that we need to face. Michelle, maybe you can elaborate a little bit. If you're looking forward, you've done a lot in the last few years, but there is much more that lies ahead. What's really needed to get to the addressing the scale of the challenge in this space?
I think, what stands out to me, and you had spoken about this morning on your panel, was about health literacy. And it comes down to this accessibility versus availability. And I think, when we look at what's available to us, from the COVID vaccine to vaccines that prevent cervical cancer and oropharyngeal cancer, I think that the science is incredible. But in order to make these things really available, we need to develop deep and trusted partnerships with leaders in communities who can be champions for, you know, these treatments and these opportunities and options for people. And I think that, you know, in the entire kind of COVID journey, it became clear that to us as, you know, part of the vaccine programs, you need someone that someone inherently trusts, and that person can become a champion. You don't have to understand every last facet of the science. I mean, frankly, I'm not an expert in mRNA vaccines, and I'm a physician. But I think, you know, I am a part of a community that I trust in terms of that science. So I think, you know, one of the primary areas for improvement and opportunities is for us to partner with community leaders to really improve availability through mutual understanding and addressing the fears that really are very real and vary across communities and should not be dismissed and should be understood and approached, so that even the incredible treatments we already have for prevention can be fully leveraged. I think that's, you know, a lot of work to be done there.
Maybe I can get you to follow up on that a little bit. Like, are you seeing those types of partnerships happen, and what makes them work or not work? And what does it look like? We look 5-10 years from now. What would you like to see?
So I want to write on the word trust, which is like the most critical ingredient, especially when you're talking about healthcare and issues that are so intimate. And the people that we push in that for us is the gender agenda. We have to look at it through the women lens as well as the biggest, you know, bearers of the pandemic or anything else for that matter. And having these partnerships be in the form of collaboration, as opposed to this top-down engagement of saving the world, or, you know, here are the beneficiaries that we want to include. So having women, actually this forum is very exciting. When I look at the stage, is having a woman in these leadership spaces, because when you look at a context like Africa today, I met somebody very interesting talking about the role of grandmothers in healthcare, and how when you look at something like the HIV/AIDS pandemic, it was grandmothers who actually really carried the weight and helped their communities. So the partnerships are super critical when you then now add in the layer of the youth, the young population. If you're talking of all these innovations and all these platforms, globally, there is no movement forward without having the young people take up the spaces. And then last but not least is seeing the Egypt being represented at that level with the idea that how do we translate these policies, these partnerships, all these technical things that we talk about. I'll finish off with an analogy, is that I felt like this platform and being in Davos has been like about designing the perfect Ferrari, right? Whether it's healthcare or finance. Now we have to go and figure out where the road is to actually speed up and get to where we need to get to go.
What would you like to see in terms of charting that trajectory? You've spoken a little bit about the sort of standards that create the grooves for us to understand the cost and scale of the challenge, and also help us, you know, make better bets in terms of targets. What do you see happening, or would like to see happen in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, I think on that question, one of the things that we see a lot happening during epidemics and pandemics is that a lot of times systems are kind of stood up in a crisis mode. And I think we really need to get out of that mindset. I mean, we even see it in the modeling approaches that are taken, that you know, you suddenly have academics who are like throwing together models and trying to collaborate kind of in real time. And I think the key really is to have systems that are going to be always on, and these include both data and the modeling that feeds from them. And that these are systems, if they're always on, they're also operating then at machine speed instead of human speed. And I think that will be a change that will be very important for the future. But to add to that, and to kind of follow up on this trust question as well, you know, we of course have seen a lot of issues with trust in the data, in the models, and how to foster that. And I think part of it does speak a bit to the health literacy, scientific literacy, modelers being able to communicate what the results are telling, what they're showing. But also that I think some of these systems that are being stood up, instead of trying to make things that are kind of specific for epidemics or pandemics, can also apply for general health system needs, endemic diseases. I think that's really the key, because we need systems that are going to be applicable kind of at any time, not just that are specific to one type of pandemic or another.
So we do have the opportunity to take some questions from the audience, if we can get a lively audience going. Does anybody have a question that they'd like to ask? I have lots of questions for the panel otherwise.
I have a question.
Yes, go for it.
I would love to know, because when the vaccine mandates were really a part of the US government's strategy, there was so much resistance, and I think what you've done with hepatitis C is just truly phenomenal. I mean, it really should be applauded, just incredible. Did you guys, when you instituted mandates on testing, what was the reaction of the population, and how did you guys, maintain trust with something that was kind of maybe being perceived to be enforced?
No, I mean, it was voluntary, right? You can
Okay.
go and test, but everyone is very curious when it's health particularly. I remember when I was working at the IMF, sometimes they would come and do a skin scan to see if you're exposed too much to sun, and we would go and volunteer just because we're curious to find out. So I think there was it was not forced testing; it was voluntary testing to provide a service. So it wasn't seen as an intrusion on personal choice or trying to collect data. It was trying to provide a service, and testing is costs. So when you're doing it for free, it was accepted, and it's also there's a return on investment from the government, because when now you are free of hepatitis C, you don't have to worry about that in the health budget. So it was a voluntary testing. It wasn't forced.
Maybe I could build upon that, because we were talking about sort of literacy and trust at the population level, but we're also talking about literacy and understanding that return on investment for health investments. And so I wonder what is your strategy or advice when you're talking to other leaders in this space? And do you think that we're seeing that understanding of the benefits, the return on investments, and the multiple advantages of this early investment, especially in the diagnostics?
I mean, when you have a big population, so we're 100 million and growing, so every dollar you can save in terms of if you can do the mitigation now and be preemptive, you can use the money for education and for other scopes of development. So I think it's an understanding of a characterization of your initial condition. I'll talk as an economist now. You characterize your initial condition. You try and see where you want to go, and also what today is the priority of any household or any individual. It's their health, it's their health of the children, and then it's being able to go to school and find a job. I think that we put it in terms of inclusiveness and productivity, but at the end of the day, on an individual level, it's being healthy, being able to go to school and find a job, and those are the priorities of any development plan for a government, and development plans are split into sectors. So I think these are some of the priorities that are on everyone's mind, and COVID pushed us further. So, for example, wages for doctors in the public sector, they were pushed up during COVID, and this was positive because you want to give that incentive. So sometimes the crisis also creates the readjustment for spending.
Well, certainly we want to not get caught in just crisis mode all of the time. And so when we're looking to go beyond crisis and actually make these sort of sustainable long-term investments, and also understanding the payoffs, I wonder if any of you would be willing to speak to what you see as being sort of promising or what is needed to have that sustained interest and investment.
I can just say that regulations are very important.
Yeah.
And the institutional setting, and it's on governments to try and open up and push for investments in healthcare. And I think that's something that we, as Egypt, we're pushing in that space. So every stakeholder has something to do, and we're trying to push in that space.
I think for delivery of services, it's investing in community health workers. What are the spaces where people get their first access to healthcare? There's the Coalition on Health Workers International. We're so happy to hear the word doctor, to hear the word lawyer. How do we translate what the pandemic did in investing at the bigger part of the pyramid? Yeah. And by investing, meaning they should maybe start getting salaried, which is not happening in most of the places. It's the same with education. Why is it that in early childhood education, that's the least incentivized and paid personnel? So we need to start moving away from that top part of the specialized pyramid, especially now that we realize from the pandemic, we are all affected by how well the bigger part of the pyramid is doing.
I think, when you look at the COVID vaccine development pace, prior to that, it was 12 years it typically took to develop a vaccine. So I think that to prove we can do it faster is phenomenal. And, now it's about how do we actually ensure that the government and our, as collaborators in science and physicians across the world and patients, that we take that same sort of initiative with every other disease that deserves that level of focus and acceleration. So kind of answering your question, I think that it's important we take what we learned, the sense of urgency, and we don't let that go, because there's so many other really important problems to approach with that similar sense of urgency.
And maybe just to add to that, I think it's such an important point, because oftentimes we do see with these crises that there's the cycle of panic and neglect that you mentioned, and so I think we certainly do need to take the momentum that we have now and really apply it to broader issues that are present in the health systems. And I think one of the key issues there as well is that if we can make these improvements and apply them towards more of the diseases that are more present and endemic, then we can, there will be continuous value that can be seen immediately, and I think that will allow it to continue to be sustained. Because if you're just planning for a pandemic that may be a 1 in 50-year event or a 1 in 30-year event, then that kind of time horizon is very difficult for people to or policymakers to plan towards.
And do you think we're seeing the stories around that burden make a difference? I mean, realistically, we've had a ton of attention that we've had on COVID, and it's so important, but often we're not necessarily seeing all of the other things that we're missing that manifest on much longer timescales. So I'm curious, from your vantage point of within this system, are that stories about the stories for hope as well as the missing areas making it out, and what else is needed?
I mean, one thing we see, kind of being a company that's partnering with the pharmaceutical companies, we were wondering, is the uptake of a new approach from a technology perspective going to sustain when the clinics open back up? And we have seen that is continuing to be sustained. Then you look at other parts of healthcare, like legislation around, say, telemedicine. During the pandemic, you could see your doctor across state lines using telemedicine. Now, there's a lot of concern about the reinstitution of some of those barriers. So I think your question is, in my opinion, still kind of remains to be seen in some areas.
I'm looking forward to seeing the impact of reskilling. That's been part of the dialogue over here. And how do we use these quick technological opportunities in order to get the the communities that are impacted to now be part of the discussion, the young people to be part of the discussion in actually implementing the change on the ground as well. So whether that's learning more about the pandemic, the treatments, and the new interventions. So reskilling and catching up with the speed of something like the pandemic has had on our communities.
Maybe, and just to add to that, I think another really important part of what we've learned in the pandemic and how to apply those lessons is the breaking of silos. Like, we really do need to break out of the areas that we're kind of most familiar with and most comfortable with. So I'm a data scientist and epidemiologist, but I think that the pandemic has shown that we can't just sit there crunching the numbers. You have to be able to work with the clinicians. You have to work with the community health workers, laboratorians, health communication, economists, social scientists. Like, it's really a whole ecosystem approach. It's, that pandemics are a whole society issue. And so I think just trying to break down those barriers really in peacetime, so to speak, and try to make those connections ahead of time between all the different parties that would need to be involved, I think is going to be really important.
Yeah, I think this is one of the reasons that having this conversation at the World Economic Forum is so important, is that we have the opportunity to build new types of coalitions, right, that can solve these complex challenges that really require different types of expertise, different types of partnerships, and a long-term planning. And so, we have a few minutes left here, and are there any more questions from the audience? You guys are a quiet audience today. Oh, okay. We'll give one opportunity for one question.
Thank you very much. I think in the pandemic, all of us became experts in science. At least I thought so myself. That said, there seems like there's a missing link here about trust. And what should we do then about education further down to children? We have to think long term, to change the system. So the question is, how should we trust the science if we don't educate early on? So is that something that is done in Egypt, for example? Is that a focus? Thank you.
Can I just say that, no, I don't want to sound pessimistic, but no matter how much we educate even ourselves, as long as there's social media and misinformation that goes around, there's a force that is always going to push us away somehow. So it's very important that we do invest, particularly at the community level, with information. And I think the government has to be transparent and create a monitoring system so that the accountability is there. But the unfortunate reality is that misinformation is going to be there. You can beat it by trying to be as transparent and as open as possible, and create the trust. But sometimes, particularly when there's a pandemic that we didn't know much about at the beginning, and as you mentioned, everybody became an expert because you're hearing from different sources, and it was a very tough situation, regardless of which level of education you're addressing. But anyway, that's...
Well, I think it speaks to another couple challenges, which is like throughout all of this, it's communication all the way up and down the system, and that's a formidable challenge, and leading with transparency at all levels is key. Did I see one more question?
It's in the same line, in fact. I was wondering how it could be that in Egypt this program was so successful, because in Egypt, like in other countries, there is mistrust in the government, and when the government comes up with a program, people will have all kinds of secondary thoughts, and we have seen it with the vaccine, of course, with the COVID vaccine, and we see now that it expands to other vaccines that were accepted. In my country, 95% was vaccinated, and now people are questioning the basic vaccines, which was not the case before. So there is a huge problem. of trust and communication there.
The example I was giving was on hepatitis C. The COVID is a and which vaccine and the efficacy of vaccines and one dose or double dose. So that is still going on, and there are better equipped experts to speak about that. But on hepatitis C, the success was the availability of the testing and also the availability of the medicines to cure, and the documentation of the experience itself.
I would say it has a lot to do with one, representation and leadership as well. If you look at the countries that did do well, allow me to say the female-led developed countries, and then the representation, even from how the pandemic started with, the origins of the pandemic was a huge issue that caused a lot of mistrust. It's a Chinese disease, or, it started off in itself from this stereotyping aspect, and that we saw it coming a lot from the leadership part of it. When it came to getting vaccines, there was a whole push of, the publicity around it. Who's getting it? Who are you trusting? From the very grassroots on our end is that, what are the religious leaders saying about this? What are the nurses themselves doing? So there's a whole dynamic in how you package and how you roll out, what we're looking for the output to be.
Thank you so much. We've really tried to bite off a very complex challenge here, and I think we've at least been able to highlight the different elements that are important here, from having leadership and investment that recognizes the returns from new approaches that can really scale across an ecosystem to many different targets, to thinking about the data challenges, to ultimately thinking about the culture and the communication and the trust. So thank you so much for joining us today. I hope we leave on an optimistic note. Thanks.
Thank you.